Okay, folks. I am going to skip the introduction and just address some things that I feel I need to say on the podcast. It seems patently obvious to me that since the murder of Renee Good, we are at an inflection point in this country. The only question is which direction we will go. I have no idea if we will go to civil war or make a gradual and then sudden slide into full on authoritarianism. And I'm afraid that a lot of us are not ready to meet the moment, regardless of what comes. And by this, I don't mean, oh, well, you gotta have guns, you gotta have supplies. No, I'm talking about emotionally and psychologically. Because there is just too many people out there who are I don't know how to phrase it exactly. But let me give you two examples. All right. Now, DHS has said that the man who murdered Renee Good suffered internal bleeding as a result. You know, because they claim that she tried to run him over with her minivan or, no, her car. And that's clearly not the case if you've watched any of the videos. That is not the case. She was not attempting to run him over at all. And people are saying things like, well, internal bleeding could mean a bruise, blah, blah, blah. No. That's not the right response. The right response is bullshit. Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. By saying, well, they could be using the fact that he bruised his thumb when he pulled the hammer back on the gun as the source of the internal bleeding. No. No, 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 no. No. You do not give that lie even threadbare credit. The man did not have any serious injuries. Period. Paragraph. And that's all that needs to be said about that. Not, well, they're trying to pass off. No, no. The fucker didn't have any serious injuries. And we know this. Not only did he immediately leave the situation under his own power, despite the fact that there was medical personnel on their way, if not already there, but then he was photographed later moving shit out of his house with no problems. By saying that he they're they're spinning his bruise into internal bleeding is giving them far more credit than they deserve. They did not have a credible story about what happened after, it came out that he had murdered her. They have not done anything that could be plausibly said to remotely match what we all saw in those videos. You might remember during the second Gulf War, when I believe her name was Jessica Lynch, and she was, U.S. military personnel. I believe she was in the Army, and she was one of the first people to be captured by Iraqi forces. And I remember watching the news accounts within, this is, within hours or so after she'd been captured. And the reporter is describing what happened when Jessica Lynch was captured. And they were saying that she fired her gun until she ran out of ammo, and then she used her M16 as a club and fought against the Iraqis until they overpowered her. And I remember watching that and going, how the fuck do they know any of this? And as we later found out, they didn't know any of it. It was all bullshit. It was all shit that they made up. And the media just parroted it back. Never once did they ask, well, how do you know this? Was there, a remote video link? Was there, video cameras on the equipment that had been left behind that recorded this? No, they didn't ask any questions. And it does, if you conclusively debunk their bullshit on the supposed internal bleeding that this guy has, they'll spin something else out and say, well, it was initially diagnosed as internal bleeding, but it turns out it was a, this or that or the other thing. None, it's not, you're playing whack-a-mole when you just need to nuke the fucking machine. And then you have what Governor Walz did on this Thursday. Yesterday, as you're listening to this, and still today. He has proposed to Trump that we turn the heat down on the rhetoric. This is utterly failing to understand not only who Trump is, but the people surrounding him. You cannot trust Trump to keep his word. So even if he agrees to turn down the rhetoric, which he won't, he will blame everybody else. I mean, I don't know if you have seen that, but he was on Air Force One and they were asking him about the shooting. And he said, well, she had a very bad tone when she was talking to the agent. That's not an exact quote, but that's the gist of what he said. She was not being respectful to him, and so essentially what he's saying is she deserved it because she wasn't kissing that guy's ass. And let's face it, what pissed that guy off was she was a woman who was not afraid of him. And that's what bothered Trump about it, because you could tell from the video that she was not afraid of her murderer. And I need to point out, there are lots of folks saying, well, this just shows they're letting anybody have a gun in ICE, and, Folks, dude had been with ICE for a decade. And in fact, I forget the title of his specialization, but he's, his job, a good portion of his job at ICE, was to train people how not to get run over by somebody. Dude is what happens when you hand a gun to somebody and you tell them you can do whatever you want and there'll be no consequences for it. And I am, I can understand where Walz is coming from. He is not running for a third term. He initially intended to, but felt that if he dropped out, there would be a better chance of keeping the governorship of the state in Democratic hands. And I can understand that. Fortunately, it looks like Senator Amy Klobuchar will replace him, and she is not someone, I think, who can rise to meet the moment. I mean, as I recall, I could be wrong on this, but as I recall, in the the first Democratic debate in 2020, or maybe it was 2019, I don't remember, but it was the first Democratic debate where they had almost all the candidates there on the stage, and I think it was Klobuchar that Kamala Harris turned to and says, "Why the hell are you running as a Democrat with what you're saying? You're not saying, you're saying, well, we can't do this, we can't do that. What's the point of running if you can't do these things?" Again, words to that effect. I may be wrong on whom Kamala said that to, but that was said at that debate to one of the other candidates on the stage, and I don't recall Klobuchar saying anything during her brief bid for the presidency that struck me as, oh, well, she'd be a good president, but maybe not my ideal choice. That would have been Warren or Sanders, but she's, she'd be okay. And what this moment truly calls for, Walz and Klobuchar are the wrong people. Walz because he's on his way out, and Klobuchar does not have, so far as I have seen, the willingness to do what needs to be done, and they're further hamstrung by the fact that the governor of the largest Democratic state, California, is term limited and he can't run. He's also piece of shit as well. But what, you know, so they're in a situation where, let's hypothetically say they know what needs to be done, and I will get to that here in a moment as to what actually they need to be doing. They're in a situation where they know they're only going to be in office for a short period of time, and they're going to have to hand off a very bad situation to the next person. And they do not want that next person to be a Republican, because that will only make things worse. And what Walz should have done is, once Renee Good was murdered, he should have gotten on the phone to the to the governor of every state that was a Democrat, where any Republican trying to run for the governorship would face a severe uphill battle. It's not every state with a Democratic governor right now, but that's several of them. And they should have arranged to have an in-person meeting within 24 hours. And at that point, they all should have agreed to call up their National Guard units and go toe-to-toe with ICE. And yes, I realize that's saying, we're headed, that's touching off a civil war. But, we're headed to that point eventually anyways, whether we go full authoritarian or not. And the sooner people realize that, and the sooner they act upon it, the better we will all be. I know people are hoping that we can things will hold off until the midterms. The Democrats will sweep both houses of Congress. They'll impeach Trump, others, and our long international nightmare will be over. It is unlikely to play out that way. For starters, this assumes that Trump won't somehow interfere with the elections. That is always possible. And really, for the sake of argument, what will happen if Democrats do manage to sweep and regain control of the House and Senate, and Trump comes out and says the election's fraudulent, and those results don't matter? Will enough of his supporters do a repeat of January 6th? I don't know. I can't rule out that possibility. But you know what else? The next Congress is not automatically seated, as was pointed out at various times in recent years after an election. Congress can refuse to seat anybody elected to either the House or the Senate if they so choose. So, unless the Democrats are able to get a majority of seats before the election, it is entirely possible that the new members could not be seated because the previous Congress refuses to allow that to happen. There's an issue. How do we fucking solve that? I don't know. And then, let's go with the next possibility that's as likely, that Trump suffers some kind of medical incident and is no longer president. Maybe he dies, or he becomes too cognitively impaired for them to even pretend to prop him up as president. Well, then you get Vance. Everybody's like, well, Vance has no charisma. Vance has no, he doesn't have the loyalty that Trump has. And among the general populace, that is true. But he doesn't need that. He's got ice. He's got ice. And if he tells those fuckers, yeah, I don't give a shit what you do, then we're in a civil war. Maybe governors will stand up to ICE at that point. Maybe not. I don't know. Vance isn't going to chuck out a lot of the people that Trump has appointed to his cabinet and things like that, because the folks like Peter Thiel, who got Vance the VP slot, wanted those fucksticks in those positions to begin with. So Vance isn't going to chuck them out. And then, most disturbing of all is, let's take an ideal scenario, okay? Either because the Democrats get such an overwhelming majority in Congress that not only do they impeach Trump and Vance and all those fucksticks, they get Democrats into the White House. What are they going to do? Because it doesn't matter how good they are unless they enact serious, massive reforms. Sooner or later, we will wind up in this same situation again. In the run-up to the 2024 election, I can remember seeing people say things like, oh, don't worry about ICE. They've got a small little budget. they can't do all these things people are saying that will happen if Trump gets elected. They just don't have the money. What the fuck happened after Trump got elected? ICE got a shitload of money so they could start doing this shit, which is not at all surprising if you know how the U.S. government works. Any Democrat who is running for Congress or the presidency has to say, we have not only got to reduce the budget for ICE, but we have to, at the very least, reform the agency so that this kind of shit can't happen again. It needs to be really, really strong legislation. We're talking, not only do you shave ICE's budget down to something reasonable, you bar them from having weapons, you bar the creation of any kind of similar agency without a 2/3 vote of Congress to support it, as well as putting in real penalties for when the president or, the Justice Department or Congress or whatever fails to follow a law. And by real penalties, I mean somebody goes to jail. It should be obvious by now that simply passing a law that says you can't do this is not good enough. It must have teeth to inflict penalties upon lawmakers. We also need insider trading reform for Congress. We need to ensure that if you're the president, you cannot profit from your office. We need to set term limits for instead of having lifetime judicial appointments, they need to be capped at, say, 20 years for judges. We need to cap the amount of time people can serve in Congress at either 18 or 24 years. We need campaign finance reform. We need laws to prevent gerrymandering. And that's just the surface. That's what an idiot in a beer can has figured out that we need. There are other things that I would very much like to see, such as every law passed by Congress must have a series of benchmarks attached to it. Where, okay, say you pass a law to reduce air pollution. Okay? Well, it needs to have a series of benchmarks that span a period of time, like, say, 5 years or 10 years. And these are objective benchmark. So, you know, you want to reduce this terrible air, pollutant from, 4,000 parts per billion to 100 parts per billion. Well, if the law, you have these benchmarks, and if the law, if you hit a certain point and it has not met the benchmarks, then Congress is required before the end of their session to pass another law that corrects the problem. That won't work with everything out there, but, because, for example, you want to make it illegal to dump any amount of a toxic chemical into a river. You can't say, well, by this point we're going to have, in 5 years we want zero. No. You want that stopped immediately, so you can't really do the benchmarks, but you could potentially do benchmarks saying, well, we have to have X amount of monitoring of the rivers, the water supply, to check for these chemicals that we don't want dumped in them by this date and time. I'm betting, however, that a large chunk of the laws that Congress pass could have objective benchmarks attached to them in one way or another. And objective is the key. And another thing that has to happen is, if a power is reserved for Congress and the president attempts to overstep his bounds or her bounds, said president must automatically be removed from office. I would also argue that there are a number of other things that need to be done that I will not go into in this episode, because of reasons, and we'll just leave it at that. But you get the idea. And I don't hear any Democratic, anyone elected to Congress or anyone who's a potential presidential candidate in 2028 saying those kinds of things. And without that shit being done, sooner or later we will wind up in this spot again. And that is all predicated on the possibility of us having elections in 2028. Which I am not optimistic about, I must admit. And something else I have to mention is that I don't know if I really don't know the structure of what I'm going to be doing with this podcast, because I realize people need breaks from the news. They need to be able to have fun. They need to, to recharge themselves, to face the horrific grind that so many of us have to deal with. But, it feels wrong for me to put out a news episode and then put out an episode of Gnostic Texts alternating back and forth when we're facing either civil war or full-on authoritarianism. I am not thrilled about either prospect, but, I know some of you who listen to this podcast. We exchange messages. And, I know things that can help keep you safe. So, I don't feel right about not telling you about this. And, the thing that about the podcast that I have that I don't have with any other social media system out there is that, if you want to hear this podcast and you're subscribed to it, you're going to get the episode. If I post something on Facebook, it doesn't matter if we're friends or not, you may not see it because the algorithm on Facebook doesn't want to show it to you for whatever reason. And if I post it on other social media platforms, there's a similar situation, even on ones that don't have algorithms governing what they show to people, simply because if you're not online at the right time, you won't see what I've posted unless you think to check. And look, I'm not telling anybody to go out and assassinate someone or how to make explosives. I just want to make sure that you have all the information you need to be safe, so that, however you decide to handle the situation, you can be safe. You want to hunker down in a cabin in the woods or whatever and not bother anybody and not be bothered. I'm fine with that. That's what you want to do? Great. I want to make sure that you're able to do that and still have an idea of what's going on in this world, so okay, the bad things are over. I can go back to my old life, or, okay, when I go into town for supplies, I need to do this or that. If you want to flee to another state or another country, here's what you need to know, so you don't have to worry that if you get stopped by authorities, they'll lock you up just because they know you want to get out of this shithole you're in. That kind of stuff. And I realize that's a bit heavy for some folks. And, I don't know how long it'll take me to do that, to make me feel comfortable that I've done everything I can to help you do what you feel you need to do and remain safe. I mean, for a couple of years now, the show notes have included links to, things to protect your privacy so you don't have to worry so much online or in the real world. And they have, links to organizations that can help people. But it's not enough. And I have to say, unfortunately, I can't put all of it out in public on the front-facing side of this. Because, with the crazy way things are, just saying certain things is enough to get you put on a fucking list. And I'm not worried so much about myself being on a list because, trust me, I'm already on them and I have been for decades now. Um, but I don't want anybody else to end up on those lists unknowingly. You know, when I was in college, I had a roommate who was a card carrying member of the Communist Party of America. So I've been, he was on a list, then that got me on a list. But, not been too terribly worried about it. And let's face it, a lot of the folks in government right now are bumbling idiots, so that one I'm not so much worried about. It's other things, there's that commercial the Midas Touch folks did some years back where it's two women in a car and they've been pulled over by the cops, and the older woman is driving and there's a younger woman in the passenger seat. The cop is asking them questions and then, looks at the youngest woman and asks her, "Are you pregnant?" And the obvious implication is that, mom is taking her daughter to get an abortion. And, that's illegal and they're going to go to jail for that, even though they're trying to get to a place where getting an abortion is perfectly legal. And holy shit, you don't even have to be doing anything illegal under a repressive system to want to avoid being bothered by the fucking cops. I'm sure we've all had the situation where, we're headed to work and we're a little late, but if everything goes our way, we'll make it there in time. And you don't want to get stopped by the cop because you got a light out, or you failed to use your turn signal, or some other little bullshit like that. So there's non-paranoid reasons to want to avoid imperial entanglements. And those are all the more important when we're dealing with a society where, bad shit is happening because of the government. There are... Who knows how many people ICE has carted off to one of their concentration camps, and then that person has been sexually assaulted. And we know that people who are here legally in the U.S. have been arrested by ICE. We know that people who are U.S. citizens have been arrested by ICE. I forget which. I'm sure there's more than one. But at least one Native American nation has said that their members of their nation have been snagged by ICE and have been held in detention because ICE doesn't think they're here legally, even though if you're a Native American and you live on a reservation in the United States, you belong here more than any white person ever fucking does. So, and we do not know how many people have died in ICE custody. We have numbers, and I'm not going to look them up because I don't trust the government's figures. Until there is a full accounting of what all is happening, I'm not going to trust any numbers. And this doesn't mean that people are necessarily being killed, because there have been, I've heard interviews with several people who have recently been pushed out of the government, and they have stated that there is a really big issue with the fact that qualified people are gone from a lot of these government offices. So the folks left don't know how to do the job properly, so you can't trust the stuff that you're getting out of them. Because literally somebody doesn't know that they're supposed to enter this information on an Excel spreadsheet, so we don't have that information. That's the level we're talking about here. Some of you are thinking, gosh, Tuck, don't you realize you're sounding like a babbling loon? Yeah, I do. And it kind of bothers me, but at the same time, go back 10 years and try to imagine what it would be like explaining everything that's happening today to yourself 10 years ago. How much of it would you have believed? So, I don't know exactly what I'm going to be doing with this podcast. I'm going to be doing something. I know I'm going to be putting out information when I can to help ensure that people be safe. I have to do some digging on some things in order to make sure that I'm getting you accurate information on some of the stuff. But that's, I'm sure there'll be things to laugh about and stuff like that, but I can't promise it. I don't know when I'll get back to the other, to the Gnostic texts. But, having read multiple accounts of what it was like to be in Germany under the Nazis, I cannot, in good conscience, fail to do everything I can to ensure that folks out there have the best chance of survival. If you have not read Maus, Volumes 1 and 2 by Art Spiegelman, that would be a good thing to check out. I would also suggest Witold Pelicki's The Auschwitz Survivor and Edward Abbey's The Monkey Wrench Gang. The Monkey Wrench Gang is not about survival in Nazi Germany. It is the book that inspired a lot of the environmental movement and has some good tips for staying safe. And for those of you who are wondering, yes, the part did arrive for the bike. It is not an exact match, but it looks close enough that it might work. I don't know. It is going to be too fucking cold and nasty for me to try and find out for certain for the foreseeable future. We have Monday off for Martin Luther King Day, and I had hoped to do the work on the bike that day or, this weekend. But it's fucking below freezing most of the time, or it's rainy and nasty. So I can't work on the bike. I will keep you updated. I mean, it's entirely possible that even though the part is not right, with minor modifications, I can get it to work. But I won't know for certain until I can tear into the bike, and that has to wait for slightly warmer and drier weather than what we're getting, as well as me having some time off. So we'll see. Also, one of the best things that you can do right now, if you have a social media account of some kind, is share your favorite podcasts. Doesn't have to be this one, but share your favorite podcasts and pressure the hosts of your favorite podcasts to share the podcasts that they listen to. That's how we ensure that people remain informed, because it's basically impossible in the U.S. to trust the mainstream media right now. So, by sharing the podcast you listen to, regardless of the subject matter, you're opening people up to more avenues, and hopefully helping them be better informed. Because hey, you share a comedy podcast, and somebody sees it, likes the comedy podcast, and they say, hey, this person who shared that podcast has good taste. Let me see what other podcasts they're listening to, and I'll start picking up on them. So you need to do that. So then oh gosh, what's this podcast? It's politics, but the person who likes it, who turned me onto this comedy podcast likes it. I'm gonna give it a shot, and then they learn something about politics they may not have otherwise done. So that is for over, I think, 2 years now. In the show notes for every episode, I have had, a link that takes you to a page that has, podcasts I listen to. They're all political and atheism related, but, I've done my part to try and get that out there, to help other people. And I've told folks who do podcasts, hey, share everything you listen to, because it'll help boost people. I can't say as anybody else has done that yet, but maybe if more people pressure them, other folks will do so. All right, it's late. I've got to get out of here. I will talk to all of you soon, and as always, may science guide your path.